Why You Wouldn't Last a Week in a Georgian Madhouse, London, 1750. On Sunday afternoons in 1750, Londoners looking for entertainment had several options. They could attend a public execution at Tyburn, which was popular. They could watch a bear baiting, which was also popular. Or they could visit Bethlem Royal Hospital, Bedlam, pay 1 penny at the gate and spend an afternoon walking through the wards looking at the patients. This was not considered unusual, it was considered a day out. The hospital sold approximately 96,000 admission tickets in the year 1780 alone, making it one of the most visited attractions in London, more popular in terms of annual footfall than most theatres. The patients did not receive a share of the ticket revenue. Nobody appears to have considered this a problem requiring discussion. Bethlem Royal Hospital was the oldest psychiatric institution in Europe, founded in 1247 as a priory and converted to the care of the mentally ill sometime in the 14th century. The exact date is uncertain, because the early records do not distinguish clearly between caring for the mentally ill and simply housing people who were inconvenient, a distinction that would remain blurry for several more centuries. By 1750, it occupied a purpose-built facility in Moorfields, a grand Baroque building completed in 1676 that was widely considered one of the finest buildings in London, and that had been designed, with a confidence that in retrospect seems somewhat misplaced, to project an image of rational order and enlightened care. The interior was less consistent with this image than the exterior suggested. The architect who designed the building was, at the time of its construction, himself confined to a different institution for mental illness. This detail was noted by contemporaries with what appears to have been genuine amusement. You arrive at Bethlem on a Sunday afternoon through the main gate on Moorfields, joining a stream of visitors that on busy days numbered in the hundreds. The building presents itself as an institution of considerable grandeur, a long, symmetrical facade with a central dome and 2 flanking wings, the whole thing projecting an air of rational purpose that distinguishes it visibly from the chaos of the London streets outside. You pay your penny to the keeper at the gate. The keeper does not ask why you have come. He has been collecting pennies long enough to have stopped thinking about the question. You walk through the gate and into the gallery, the long corridor that runs the length of each wing and along which the patient cells are arranged behind iron grates. And the Sunday afternoon visit to Bedlam has begun. The smell arrives before anything else. The smell is significant. The galleries of Bethlem were wide enough for visitors to walk comfortably in groups of several people abreast, which was part of the design. The hospital's income from visitors was a meaningful contribution to its operating budget, and the architecture reflected this. Along each side of the gallery ran the cells, separated from the corridor by iron grates through which patients and visitors could see each other with complete mutual clarity. The patients were chained in many cases. Chaining was considered a standard management tool for patients deemed dangerous or uncontrollable, and the definition of dangerous was sufficiently broad that a patient who expressed agitation at being chained was thereby demonstrating the agitation that justified the chaining. The visitors who walked the gallery were encouraged to engage with the patients, to talk to them, to provoke reactions, to observe the varieties of madness on display. Some visitors brought food to give through the grates. Some brought sticks to poke through. The distinction between these 2 types of visitor was not one the hospital's admission policy attempted to make. The reversal of expectation that Bethlem most insistently demands from modern understanding is this: a significant proportion of the people confined in it were not, by any clinical definition that has survived the intervening centuries, mentally ill. Bethlem's admission process in 1750 required a certificate signed by a parish officer attesting to the patient's lunacy, and the standard of evidence required to obtain such a certificate was, by modern standards, remarkably low. A husband who wished to be rid of an inconvenient wife could obtain a certificate with relatively little difficulty if he had the right connections and the right narrative. A creditor who wished to neutralize a difficult debtor had similar options. Families who found a relative's behavior embarrassing, whether through genuine mental illness, through political or religious nonconformity, or through simple inconvenience, had in Bethlem a mechanism for removal that was cheaper than other alternatives and carried a social stigma that largely prevented the confined person from mounting an effective public objection. The person who protested most vigorously that they did not belong in Bethlem was, by the logic of the institution, demonstrating exactly the kind of agitation that confirmed they did. The medical treatment available at Bethlem in 1750 was grounded in humoral theory, the same theoretical framework that governed all Georgian medicine, and consisted primarily of bloodletting, purging, and a practice called ducking, in which patients were immersed in cold water on the theory that the shock would restore the balance of humours disturbed by madness. The physician responsible for the medical care of Bethlem's patients visited the hospital twice a week. The rest of the time, care was provided by keepers, staff whose qualifications were not medical and whose primary function was custodial rather than therapeutic. The keepers were paid partly in tips from visitors, which created an incentive structure that aligned their interests with providing an entertaining experience for paying guests, rather than a comfortable one for confined patients. These interests were not always compatible. The keepers generally resolved the incompatibility in favour of the revenue. The case of William Norris, discovered by reformers in 1814, is the detail that brought Bethlem's conditions to sustained public attention in a way that no amount of reformist writing had previously achieved. Norris had been confined in Bethlem for approximately 12 years. When the reformers found him, he was secured to a wall by an iron apparatus of considerable ingenuity. A collar around his neck connected by a short chain to a bar fixed to the wall, with additional restraints on his arms and legs that allowed him to stand or lie down, but prevented him from moving more than approximately 12 inches in any direction. He had been in this arrangement for years. The apparatus had been designed by the hospital's own smith and was considered by the staff a model of restraint engineering. Norris was, by the time he was found, in extremely poor physical health. He died within months of being discovered. The reformers published a drawing of his situation. It was reproduced across Europe. Bethlem's visiting policy was suspended shortly afterward, not because the institution had changed, but because the audience for the Sunday afternoon visits had been shown what they had been paying to sustain. Getting out of Bethlem, once you were in it, was considerably more difficult than getting in, for reasons that had less to do with physical security than with the institutional logic of the certification process. Release required a certificate attesting to the patient's recovery, signed by the same category of parish officer who had certified the original admission. If the admission had been arranged by a family member or creditor who had no interest in the patient's release, obtaining that certificate required either the cooperation of the certifying officer, which the person who had arranged the admission could often prevent, or a legal challenge that required resources, connections, and a public credibility that confinement in Bethlem had, by definition, substantially reduced. The patient who had been admitted on fabricated grounds had, by the act of admission, been placed in a position where the evidence for their sanity was structurally inaccessible, and the evidence for their insanity was institutionally maintained. Bethlem was not designed as a trap. It functioned as one anyway, which is a distinction without much practical difference for the people inside it. The reform of Bethlem came slowly and incompletely, as the reform of Georgian institutions generally did, through the accumulated pressure of reformers who found the institution's conditions morally intolerable and said so in print with enough persistence that the public eventually agreed. William Hogarth included Bethlem as the final scene of his series A Rake's Progress in 1735. The rake, who has dissipated his fortune, ends his life chained in Bedlam, surrounded by other patients, while fashionably dressed women watch from a respectful distance. Hogarth's image is so accurate in its details that historians use it as documentary evidence of conditions in the hospital. The fashionably dressed women are not satirical invention. They were a regular feature of the Sunday afternoon visit. They were paying customers. They were part of the business model. The numbers that frame Bethlem's history are numbers that the institution recorded with administrative thoroughness. In 1750, the hospital held approximately 250 patients in a building designed for considerably fewer. The visiting revenue supplemented a budget that was otherwise funded by charitable donations and a small parliamentary grant. Bethlem was a charity hospital, which meant its finances were perpetually precarious, and its incentives for maintaining visitor numbers were not purely commercial, but genuinely existential. The 96,000 annual visitors recorded in 1780 paid 1 penny each on most days, with higher charges for private tours. The total visitor revenue in that year ran to several £100, a meaningful fraction of the hospital's operating budget. The institution's survival depended, in a very direct sense, on its patients remaining interesting to the paying public. This created a set of institutional incentives whose implications were not, apparently, examined with any great care by the hospital's governors. Bethlem was rebuilt and relocated multiple times over its history, from Moorfields to St George's Fields in Southwark in 1815 and again to Beckenham in Kent in 1930. And each relocation was accompanied by reforms that reduced the most visible abuses while leaving the underlying institutional logic largely intact. The public visiting policy was ended in 1817, following the scandal of William Norris and the parliamentary inquiry that followed it. Chaining was abolished. The medical staff's visiting schedule was increased. The keepers were placed on fixed salaries rather than being partially compensated through visitor tips, which removed at least one of the more obvious perverse incentives. The building in Moorfields was demolished. Its facade was preserved and eventually became the entrance to the Imperial War Museum, which is now located on the site of the St George's Fields building, a coincidence of institutional geography that says something interesting about the relationship between different varieties of national trauma, though exactly what it says depends on how charitable you are feeling toward the curators. You spent your Sunday afternoon in Bethlem walking the gallery, paying your penny, observing the patients through the iron grates with the interested attention of a person who has come to see something worth seeing. You went home. The patients remained. On Monday morning, the keeper arrived and the week began again. The chains, the cold water, the twice-weekly physician's visit, the humoral treatments that the theory said should help, and the patient's continued presence in Bethlem suggested were not helping, and the Sunday afternoon visit at the end of it, when the pennies came in and the public walked the gallery and found the whole thing, on balance, worth the price of admission. Bethlem is still operating today in Beckenham as a psychiatric hospital that does not charge admission and does not chain its patients and has substantially better outcomes than its predecessor. The building in Moorfields, where the Sunday visitors paid their penny, is gone. The Imperial War Museum occupies the ground where the patients were. The admission is free now. Nobody appears to have noted the irony.